There is a specific comfort in a plumb line. It is a simple tool, a weight suspended on a string, yet it dictates the absolute vertical truth of the world. Gravity does not lie. Stone, timber, and iron must answer to it. I am a man who has spent 38 years trusting the plumb line, the surveyor's chain, and the immutable laws of mathematics. My name is Elias Vance. In the autumn of 1888, I was the senior structural auditor for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. My job was not a romantic one. I did not hunt outlaws or write sensational penny dreadfuls. I hunted rot. I hunted subsidence. When a property owner defaulted on their taxes or a massive estate was forfeited to the state, I was the man sent into the dust and the dark to determine exactly what the Commonwealth now owned. I dealt in the cold, hard currency of reality. So when the assignment for Harrow's Creek landed on my desk in Harrisburg, I saw nothing but a logistical headache. The file was thin, bound in frayed twine that smelled of old tobacco. It concerned a property deep in the Allegheny Mountains, the Harrow Academy for Indigent Youth. Founded in 1872 by a Dr. Silas Harrow, the institution was ostensibly a charitable boarding school for the orphaned and the unwanted. According to the state records, the school had abruptly ceased operations 6 months prior, in April of 1888. No bankruptcy was filed, no transfer of wards was documented. The tax payments simply stopped, and Dr. Harrow vanished from the public registry. The Commonwealth wanted the land assessed for its timber and the stone structures evaluated for auction. It was a 3-week expedition into one of the most hostile, isolated topographies in the eastern United States. The journey began with a grueling 2-day train ride that deposited me at a terminus town called Oak Haven. To call Oak Haven a town would be a generous exaggeration. It was a festering wound of a settlement, a collection of soot-stained logging shacks huddled together at the base of a jagging mountain pass. The air here was heavy, tasting permanently of wet coal ash and decaying pine needles. It was mid-October, and a bitter, unseasonable sleet was falling as I stepped off the train, my heavy canvas valise and transit fiodolite case slung over my shoulders. I made my way to the only establishment that boasted a painted sign, the Blackwood Livery and Provision. Inside, the air was suffocatingly warm, smelling of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and unwashed bodies. 6 men sat around a cast-iron stove. They did not stop talking when I entered. They simply hadn't been talking at all. The silence in the room was dense, measured, and deeply unwelcoming. I approached the counter, behind which stood a man with skin like cured tobacco and eyes the color of dirty ice. "I need to hire a horse and a buckboard," I said, keeping my tone professional, projecting my voice just enough to establish authority. "And I require lodging for the night before I head up the mountain tomorrow." The man did not blink. He slowly wiped a dirty rag across the scarred wood of the counter. "No rooms, and the horses don't go up the mountain this late in the year." "It is barely mid-October," I countered, pulling my Commonwealth badge from my heavy wool coat and placing it deliberately on the counter. "I am surveying the Harrow property on behalf of the state. I am authorized to requisition transport and will pay double your standard rate." At the mention of the name Harrow, the dynamic of the room shifted. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or a sudden clatter of dropped glasses. It was a subtle collective stiffening. The ambient sound of breathing seemed to shallow. The man behind the counter stared at the brass badge, then up at my face. He didn't look frightened. He looked profoundly exhausted. "You can flash all the Commonwealth brass you want, Mr. Vance. A badge don't make the mud any less deep, and it don't make a horse walk where it knows it shouldn't. The road to Harrow's Creek washed out 3 years ago. It's a 7-mile hike up the switchbacks. You walk it, or you don't go." I narrowed my eyes. "And the school? What can you tell me of the structural condition? Did Dr. Harrow maintain the road while he was operating?" A low, humorless sound that might have been a laugh came from one of the men by the stove. The man at the counter leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. "The Academy took in the dregs, Mr. Vance. The kids nobody wanted. The kids from the city slums who wouldn't be missed if they coughed themselves to death in the winter." "Are you suggesting negligence?" I asked, pulling a leather-bound notebook from my breast pocket and a silver pencil. "If there is evidence of criminal neglect regarding the state's wards, I am obligated to—" "I ain't suggesting nothing," the man interrupted, his eyes suddenly hard, flashing with a warning I could not quite decipher. "I'm telling you that Harrow's Creek is a place that eats people. It eats money, it eats charity, and it eats time. You want to go measure it? Fine. I'll sell you dried meat and oil for your lantern, but you walk alone. And Mr. Vance," he leaned closer, the smell of stale gin washing over me, "do your counting fast. The cold up there ain't like the cold down here. It gets into your bones, and it makes you tired. Very, very tired." I dismissed his dramatic fatalism as the typical superstition of uneducated mountain folk. I bought my provisions, secured a cot in the corner of the livery's drafty barn for the night, and prepared my equipment. I oiled my chains, calibrated my compass, and reviewed the architectural blueprints the state had provided. The blueprints showed a massive 3-story central building flanked by 2 dormitory wings, built over a deep stone foundation. It was a formidable structure, built to last a century. The next morning, I began the ascent. The man at the livery had not lied about the road. It was less a thoroughfare and more a jagged scar carved into the side of the mountain, heavily eroded by years of unchecked runoff. The hike was punishing. My boots sunk into the freezing gray mud, and the heavy leather case containing my surveying instruments dug painfully into my shoulder with every step. As I climbed higher, the environment began to change in a way that defied the natural seasonal shifts. Lower in the valley, the trees were ablaze with the dying reds and golds of autumn. But as I crossed the ridgeline and descended into the isolated basin of Harrow's Creek, the color was violently stripped away. The deciduous trees vanished, replaced entirely by ancient, towering eastern hemlocks and white pines. Their dense, dark green canopies interlocked overhead, choking out the weak October sun. The underbrush was dead, replaced by a thick carpet of acid pine needles that muffled my footsteps to a dull, deadened thud.
The silence here was absolute. There were no squirrels chattering, no crows calling from the high branches. There was no wind. The air felt heavy, dense with moisture, and it held a frigid stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. I checked my pocket watch. It was precisely 1:45 p.m., but the twilight gloom of the basin made it feel like dusk. I rounded a sharp bend in the trail, wiping cold sweat from my brow, and stopped dead. Through a break in the skeletal pines, the Harrow Academy for Indigent Youth finally revealed itself. It did not sit harmoniously in the valley. It dominated it like a physical threat. The main structure was a sprawling, asymmetrical monolith of dark, rough-hewn mountain granite and slate-gray timber. The architecture was imposing, a brutalist interpretation of Gothic design. 3 massive square chimneys rose from the steeply pitched roof like the smokestacks of a landlocked dreadnought. Even from a distance of 200 yards, my trained eye immediately recognized something deeply unsettling about the building's geometry. I set down my heavy case, pulled out my brass telescope, and extended it. I focused on the facade. The windows of the first and second floors were tall and narrow, heavily barred with wrought iron, a feature not uncommon for an orphanage to prevent runaways, but the thickness of the iron was excessive. It was industrial. But it was the roofline that made my skin crawl with a professional unease. As I traced the peaks and valleys of the slate roof, the proportions did not align with the blueprints in my pocket. The east wing extended a full 20 feet further than the foundation line suggested on paper. There was a blind spot in the architecture, a massive volume of enclosed space on the eastern side that had no corresponding windows, no chimneys, and no obvious access points. A structure of that size, carrying that much dead weight without proper ventilation or light, went against every principle of structural engineering. It was deliberately concealed space. I collapsed the telescope, the brass sliding shut with a sharp clack that echoed too loudly in the dead valley. I told myself it was simply a later addition, poorly documented by a sloppy architect. I am a man of reason. I picked up my equipment and walked down the final slope toward the massive, swollen oak double doors of the main entrance. The damp stone of the front steps was slick with a vibrant, toxic-looking green moss. I reached out, grasping the heavy iron ring of the right door. The metal was freezing, biting into my bare palm. I braced my shoulder against the wet wood and shoved. With a sound like a tortured groan, the seal broke, and the heavy door swung inward into the absolute pitch-black maw of the academy. A breath of air washed out from the interior over my face. It was the smell of old dust, dry rot, and something far beneath it, the faint, undeniable copper scent of dried blood. I lit my lantern, its weak yellow beam cutting into the darkness, and I stepped across the threshold. The heavy oak doors shut behind me with a sickening final thud, cutting off the weak gray light of the afternoon. The vacuum of the massive foyer immediately swallowed the sound. I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust, the heavy brass ring of my lantern handle cold against my palm. A good surveyor knows that a building speaks before you ever lay a chain to its floors. A house settling on its foundations will sigh, rotting timber will pop, a draft will hum through poorly sealed casements. But Harrow Academy was utterly, unnervingly mute. The silence was so dense it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums, broken only by the ragged, amplified sound of my own breathing. I raised the lantern. The beam cut a narrow yellow cone through the stagnant air, illuminating millions of dust motes suspended in a lazy, permanent drift. The foyer was cavernous. The floor was laid in a checkerboard of slate and pale marble, coated in a thick layer of grime. Above me, a grand double staircase of dark mahogany swept upward to a balustraded landing, its grandeur mocking the indigent nature of the children it supposedly housed. I pulled my leather-bound ledger, my silver pencil, and my Gunter's measuring chain from my case. I am a man of procedure. Fear is the enemy of accuracy. I began on the ground floor. The western wing consisted of what were clearly classrooms. I paced them out, dragging the brass links of my chain across the warped floorboards. Clink, drag, clink. The sound was offensively loud. The rooms were uniform, 30 feet by 40 feet, high ceilings, tall windows caked in years of accumulated soot. There were no desks left, no blackboards, no forgotten primers. The walls were stripped bare, the plaster peeling away in long gray strips like dead skin. It was as if the concept of childhood itself had been methodically scrubbed from the premises. Moving to the rear of the main structure, I documented the kitchens and the mess hall. Here, the utilitarian cruelty of Dr. Harrow's design became stark. The cast-iron stoves were massive industrial things, capable of boiling cauldrons of gruel, but the eating benches were narrow, rough-hewn pine.
I noticed deep grooves worn into the stone floor beneath the tables, the frantic, repetitive scraping of hundreds of small boots over a decade and a half. It took me precisely 2 hours and 15 minutes to complete the ground floor schematics. By 4:30 p.m., the light outside the barred windows was completely gone, leaving me entirely dependent on the hissing glow of my oil lantern. I approached the grand staircase to ascend to the dormitories. With every step I took, the wood shrieked in protest. The air on the second floor was noticeably different. Downstairs it had been cold and damp. Up here it was bone dry, carrying a faint medicinal odor, something sharp and chemical like carbolic acid and old dried lavender, masking the lingering scent of unwashed bodies. I turned down the hallway leading into the east wing, the wing that had troubled my eye from the exterior. I pushed open the double doors to the boys' dormitory, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a cavernous hall running the length of the wing. Down the central aisle and lining both the left and right walls were the rusted iron frames of beds, dozens of them, perhaps 80 in total. They sat in perfect military alignment. I walked down the central aisle, my lantern casting long, distorted shadows of the iron headboards against the peeling wallpaper. I stopped by one of the frames and examined it. I am a man of measurements, and the geometry here was hateful. The beds were exactly 24 inches apart. A grown man could not walk comfortably between them. But worse than the spacing was the anchoring. I brushed the dust from the feet of the cot. They were bolted to the floorboards with heavy carriage lag screws. You do not bolt a child's bed to the floor to keep it tidy. You bolt it to the floor so it cannot be moved during a struggle. I looked closer at the rusted side rails. At the head and foot of every single iron frame were heavy leather straps. They were cracked and stiff with age, but their purpose was unmistakable. They were restraints. A cold sweat broke across my shoulder blades. I stood up quickly, retreating to the center of the aisle. I told myself it was for their own protection, perhaps to prevent the spread of disease, or to manage children suffering from night terrors or the delirium of fever. I forced my mind back to the mathematics of the room. I took the end of my surveyor's chain and hooked it to the doorframe. I walked the length of the dormitory, counting the links. 10 feet, 20, 50, 70. I reached the far wall, a solid expanse of faded floral wallpaper, and pulled the chain taut. 82 feet. I pulled my exterior notes from my pocket. From the outside, the eastern wing measured 115 feet from the central hub to the gable end, allowing for the thickness of the exterior stone and the interior lath and plaster. The interior measurement should have been no less than 110 feet. I was missing nearly 30 feet of architecture. A discrepancy of a few inches is a carpenter's error. A discrepancy of 30 feet is a deliberate concealment. I walked up to the blank rear wall of the dormitory. I raised my fist and knocked heavily against the faded wallpaper. It did not produce the dull, heavy thud of stone or brick. It produced a sharp, hollow crack, wooden paneling set behind the lath and plaster. I paced the width of the wall, tapping every 2 feet, mapping the hollow sound. Exactly in the center, between 2 iron cots, the sound changed. It became slightly denser. A framework, a door. I set my lantern on the floor. I drew a heavy flathead iron chisel and a wooden mallet from my canvas tool bag. I am a man of procedure. Fear is the enemy of accuracy. I wedged the cold iron of the chisel into the nearly invisible seam of the wallpaper. I struck the chisel with the mallet. The sound was a gunshot in the dead silence of the dormitory. I struck it again and again, driving the iron deep into the seam. With a sharp twist of my wrist, the ancient wood groaned, the wallpaper tore with a dry ripping sound, and a concealed, flush-mounted door popped ajar. A draft of freezing, foul air rushed out from the dark space beyond, extinguishing my lantern instantly. I was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The smell that hit me was no longer just carbolic acid and dust. It was the heavy, sweet, unmistakable stench of medicinal ether and old decay. My hands shook as I fumbled in my vest pocket for my matchbook. I struck a sulfur match against the abrasive strip, the sudden flare momentarily blinding me. I relit the lantern, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I held the lamp up and pushed the concealed door wide open. Beyond the dormitory wall was not another room, but a narrow claustrophobic corridor running parallel to the sleeping quarters. It was barely 3 feet wide, built entirely of unpainted pine. But it was what lined the walls of this secret corridor that chilled me to my very marrow. At regular intervals corresponding exactly to the placement of the beds on the other side of the wall were small brass-rimmed viewing ports, peepholes. They were fitted with sliding shutters designed so that whoever stood in this dark corridor could observe the children in their restraints without ever being seen. And at the far end of this voyeuristic tunnel, illuminated weakly by my trembling lantern, was a narrow, steep set of wooden stairs leading straight down into the absolute pitch black of the lower levels. Dr. Harrow was not just housing indigent youth, he was observing them. And as I stepped into the hidden corridor, feeling the temperature drop another 10 degrees, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was about to find out exactly what he had been waiting to see.
I stood at the precipice of the hidden stairwell, my brass lantern held high, the weak yellow light struggling to penetrate the gloom below. The air rising from the shaft was thick, tasting heavily of damp earth, old iron, and that lingering sterile sweetness of ether. Logic is a surveyor's anchor. When the world presents an anomaly, you measure it until it makes sense. I pulled my notebook from my breast pocket. I noted the width of the stairwell, exactly 32 inches, the tread depth, 9 inches. I forced my mind into the rigid, comforting boxes of mathematics. I would descend, I would map this unrecorded space, and I would report it to the Commonwealth. I took the first step. The ancient pine groaned beneath my weight, a sound that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. I counted the stairs as I descended. 10, 20, 30. By the time I reached the 35th step, the temperature had plummeted. The dry, medicinal chill of the upper dormitory was gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating damp of deep subterranean earth. I was now well below the frost line, deeper than the primary basement I had mapped earlier from the exterior blueprints, 42 steps. The wooden stairs ended abruptly on a floor of rough-hewn, irregular flagstone. I swept my lantern across the space. It was a narrow corridor, constructed entirely of massive, unmortared foundation stones. The walls wept with dark, mineral-stained moisture. It was a space designed neither for comfort nor for storage. It was a space designed to bear immense weight and keep secrets buried. I paced the corridor, the iron links of my chain clinking against the wet stone. 60 feet in, the passage dead-ended into a solid wall of brick. But right before the dead end, set flush into the left-hand wall, was a heavy door bound in blackened iron straps. There was no handle, only a large, archaic keyhole and a recessed iron ring. I pressed my gloved hand against the wood.
It was freezing, swollen tight into its stone frame by decades of ambient moisture. I gripped the iron ring with both hands, braced my boot against the stone wall, and pulled. It did not yield. I am not a large man, but I possess the wiry strength of one who wrestles heavy transits up mountainsides. I pulled again, channeling my rising, irrational panic into pure mechanical leverage. With a sound like a dry bone snapping, the swollen wood scraped against the stone, the vacuum seal broke, and the door lurched outward in a shower of rust and dust. I stepped into the room beyond. It was a perfectly preserved study, completely insulated from the rot that plagued the upper floors. The air here was perfectly still, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old dried paper. In the center of the room sat a massive, dark mahogany desk. A leather, high-backed chair stood behind it, pushed back slightly, as if its occupant had just stepped away. An oil lamp, dry and dusty, sat beside a silver fountain pen that had long since tarnished black. But what drew my eye, what commanded the room, was the iron safe built directly into the rear wall. It was a formidable piece of late-century engineering, standing 5 feet tall, its black enamel face unblemished. I approached it, my surveyor's instincts momentarily overridden by a deep, hollow dread. I set my lantern on the desk. I expected the safe to be locked, to require a charge of black powder or a master locksmith to open. But as I grasped the heavy brass wheel and turned it, the internal tumblers clicked with a smooth, well-oiled precision. It had not been locked. It had been left ready. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, stacked in meticulous chronological order, were dozens of leather-bound ledgers. These were not the public accounting books of the Harrow Academy. Those had been submitted to the state, detailing meager rations, textbook purchases, and the wages of a skeletal staff. I pulled the heaviest ledger from the middle shelf, its spine stamped with the year 1881. I carried it to the desk, opened it beneath the light of my lantern, and began to read. Story disclaimer. The stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. This content is created solely for spine-tingling entertainment. And if this content has value for you, give us a like, subscribe, and share a comment with the community. I am a man who deals in numbers. I understand the language of ledgers. I understand debits, credits, and the cold, unfeeling assessment of property. But the accounting I found in Dr. Silas Harrow's private books shattered the boundaries of my sanity. The entries were written in a spidery, immaculate script. The ink was an oxidized, rusty brown. The school was not a charitable institution. It was a farm, and Dr. Harrow was not an educator. He was a harvester. I turned to an entry dated November 14th, 1881. It read, "Intake, 6 units from the Philadelphia Almshouse. 3 exhibit early-stage consumption. 1 displays signs of acute dementia. 2 appear robust but melancholic. Placed in Upper East Ward. Restraints required for the melancholics. Diet restricted to water and bromide solution. Observation commenced." My finger traced the lines, my mind struggling to process the clinical detachment of the words. I flipped forward a few pages, the heavy paper rasping in the dead quiet of the study. December 2nd, 1881, Unit 4, Philadelphia intake. Dementia, expired at 0300 hours. Condition of the brain is pristine for study. Preparation complete. Transferred to lower loading bay via the service tunnel. Dispatch via the midnight freight to Mutter intermediaries. Compensation received, $350. A sickening realization washed over me. Cold and heavy as lead. The hidden corridor behind the dormitory, the peepholes, the bolted beds. Harrow was observing the progression of diseases. He was starving them, drugging them, and waiting for them to die, or perhaps hastening the process when a specific order came in from the less scrupulous medical colleges of the East Coast. They needed fresh cadavers, rare pathologies, and untouched anatomical specimens. Harrow was providing hiding them, using the forgotten children of the state as his inventory. I frantically pulled down the final ledger, the one marked 1888, the year the school abruptly closed. The handwriting here was different. The meticulous spidery script had deteriorated into jagged, frantic slashes. The ink was uneven, smudged in places. The entries were shorter, betraying a rising panic. March 10th, 1888. A state auditor has been inquiring in Harrisburg. The Commonwealth is asking for the wards. The records cannot be reconciled. We cannot move the remaining inventory. The roads are watched. I turned the page, my hand trembling so violently the shadows danced wildly across the damp stone walls. April 4th, 1888. The inspectors arrive in 3 weeks. The operation is compromised. I cannot allow the specimens to be discovered in their current state. The bromide supply is exhausted. They are waking up. They are screaming. The noise is intolerable. I turned to the very last page of the ledger. There was only one entry, written in large, forceful letters that deeply indented the thick paper. April 12th, 1888. Protocol Epsilon initiated. All remaining 27 units relocated from the East Ward to the primary subterranean cistern. The heavy iron grate has been sealed. The lead rivets are set. May God forgive the mathematics of survival. I depart tonight. I stared at the words. 27 units, the primary subterranean cistern, sealed. My breath hitched. The silence of the room suddenly felt entirely different. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a grave. As a surveyor, I knew the blueprints. I knew exactly where the primary cistern was located. It was a massive brick-lined reservoir built to hold thousands of gallons of mountain runoff, situated directly beneath the central courtyard. And according to my spatial calculations, the brick wall at the end of the stone corridor, outside this very study, was the outer wall of that cistern. I slowly closed the ledger. I did not want to leave the study. I did not want to walk back out into that corridor. But the compulsion of my profession, the absolute need to verify, to measure the extent of the horror, drew me to my feet. I picked up my lantern, the handle slick with my own cold sweat, and walked out of the study, turning my gaze toward the dead-end brick wall.
I stepped out of the preserved study and back into the subterranean corridor. The temperature seemed to have plummeted further, the dampness clinging to my wool coat like a second freezing skin. I held my lantern out, the trembling yellow beam washing over the rough-hewn flagstones, stretching toward the dead-end wall of brick 60 feet ahead. Every instinct honed by 38 years of life screamed at me to turn back, to ascend those wooden stairs, to flee into the Appalachian night and never speak of this valley again. But I am a surveyor. I am bound by the compulsion to map the unknown, to quantify the space, and to establish the absolute truth of a boundary. I walked toward the brick wall. With every step, the acoustic quality of the corridor changed. The sound of my boots on the stone grew muted, swallowed by the immense oppressive mass of the earth above and the sheer volume of the empty space that lay just beyond the masonry. I reached the wall. I raised the lantern. The brickwork was a violent intrusion upon the original stone foundation. It was constructed of cheap, red industrial kiln brick, the mortar slapped on thick and haphazardly. It was the frantic, sloppy work of a man terrified of being caught, not the measured craft of a mason. At the center of the wall, about 3 feet off the ground, was a massive circular iron access hatch, perhaps 4 feet in diameter. It was designed for a man to climb through to clean the cistern during dry seasons. But it would never be opened again. The edges of the iron hatch were fused to the iron frame with thick, crude pools of melted lead. Heavy iron rivets had been driven through the hinges and hammered flat. It was permanently, irrevocably sealed. I brought my face close to the iron. The metal was so cold it radiated a physical ache into my cheekbones.
I smelled the stagnant dead water resting tens of feet below, carrying the faint, unmistakable odor of calcium and decay. "Protocol Epsilon," I whispered. My voice was a dry rasp that immediately died in the damp air. 27 units, relocated to the primary subterranean cistern, sealed. I placed my gloved hand against the lead rivets. I tried to imagine the logistics of the atrocity. 27 children, weakened by malnutrition and bromide sedation, herded down the hidden stairwell in the dead of night, forced through this narrow hatch into the pitch-black freezing water of the holding tank, and then the clang of the iron door shutting, the hiss of the melting lead. My surveyor's mind, usually a fortress of logic, began to buckle. I found myself calculating the volume of the cistern against the cubic feet of air it contained. I calculated how long 27 pairs of lungs could breathe before the oxygen turned to poison. I calculated how long it takes for a human body to succumb to hypothermia in 60-degree water. It was a math of pure, unadulterated madness. I pressed my ear flush against the freezing iron of the sealed hatch. I told myself I was listening for the structural integrity of the reservoir. I told myself I was listening for the natural drip of groundwater. At first, there was only the deep, resonant hum of the earth. But as I held my breath, straining against the absolute silence, another sound emerged from the cavernous blackness on the other side of the wall. It was faint, distorted by the thickness of the iron and the vast echo chamber of the brick cistern. Tap, tap, tap. It was a delicate, rhythmic sound, like bare knuckles weakly rapping against wet brick. Tap, tap, tap. Reason demanded an explanation. It was a weeping pipe. It was the settling of the foundation. It was a pocket of trapped marsh gas bubbling to the surface of the stagnant water. But the cadence was too uniform. It was the tempo of a heartbeat. It was the desperate, exhausted rhythm of something that had been trapped in the dark for 6 months, trying to find a seam in the stone. Or perhaps it was merely the acoustic memory of their final hours, permanently recorded into the architecture of the space, playing back in an endless loop for the only man who had ever bothered to come down and listen. I did not scream. The horror I felt was too vast, too heavy for something as simple as a scream. I slowly pulled my ear away from the iron. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the sealed hatch. I did not run. Panic is the enemy of precision, and I needed every ounce of precision I possessed to navigate my way back to the surface. I returned to the study. I meticulously packed Dr. Harrow's ledgers into my heavy canvas valise, wrapping them in my spare wool shirt to protect them from the damp. I gathered my chain, my plumb line, and my notebook. The ascent up the hidden stairwell was agonizing. My legs felt like lead. My lungs burned with the thin, foul air. When I finally pushed through the concealed door and stumbled out into the ruined dormitory of the East Wing, I collapsed onto the dusty floorboards. I lay there for a long time, listening to the shrieking wind that had finally begun to tear through the Appalachian pines outside, a sound that suddenly felt like a blessing. I left Harrow Academy just as the sun began to break over the eastern ridge, casting a cold, indifferent light over the decaying stone. I never submitted my audit to the Commonwealth. When I returned to Harrisburg, I filed a report that the structural integrity of the Harrow Academy was fatally compromised by black mold and foundation subsidence. I reported that the timber was utterly worthless due to deep, pervasive rot, and that the property held negative value for the state. I recommended it be condemned and left to the elements. The bureaucrats, eager to wash their hands of a useless parcel of mountain scrub, rubber-stamped my assessment without a second thought. 5 years later, in the dry summer of 1893, a massive forest fire swept through that isolated valley. It consumed the pines, the hemlocks, and the sprawling timber upper floors of the academy. Only the stone foundation remained, a blackened, forgotten scar in the earth, and the heavy iron grate in the basement remained untouched. I am an old man now. I have retired from the Commonwealth. I no longer climb mountains or measure the boundaries of forgotten estates. I live in a quiet house in Philadelphia, surrounded by neat paved streets and the comforting glow of electric street lamps. But beneath the floorboards of my own study, locked inside a lead-locked box, are the ledgers of Dr. Silas Harrow. I kept them because I knew the state would not seek justice. They would only seek to bury the scandal, to protect their own negligent oversight. And I kept them because some truths are too heavy to be placed on the scales of public record. I still believe in the plumb line. I still believe that the world is governed by immutable laws of physics and mathematics. But I have learned that human cruelty operates on a geometry entirely its own. It builds blind corners, hidden corridors, and sealed chambers in the soul. History is not what we remember, it is what we refuse to uncover. We walk over the surface of the earth, trusting the ground beneath our feet, willfully ignorant of the dark, stagnant spaces where the forgotten have been locked away. We assume the silence of the past is a peaceful rest, because we are too terrified to press our ears to the cold iron and listen. But I know what I heard at Harrow's Creek. I know the sound of a silence that will not stay quiet. It is a slow, methodical tapping in the dark, the sound of history, waiting patiently for the mortar to finally crumble.